When Tinubu's envoys landed in Ouagadougou, they carried briefcases full of promises and threats. They expected handshakes. They expected negotiations. They expected Captain Ibrahim Traoré to fall in line like every other African leader before him. They got silence instead. For 50 years, West Africa's power has been traded in quiet rooms, signed away with handshakes, money, and betrayal. From the fall of Thomas Sankara to the rise of France's puppets across the region, the script never changed. Leaders bowed when Abuja whispered. Countries bent when Nigeria flexed. That's how the game worked. Until it didn't. Tinubu sent 5 men to Burkina Faso with one mission: bring Traoré back under control. Make him rejoin ECOWAS. Make him drop his alliance with Mali and Niger. Make him remember that Nigeria runs West Africa, and defiance has consequences. The envoys arrived with documents promising billions in aid, trade deals, and security partnerships. But everyone knew the truth. These weren't gifts. They were chains wrapped in expensive paper. Traoré saw through it immediately. And instead of sitting down to negotiate, instead of playing the diplomatic game, he did something no one expected. He refused to meet them at all. Not in private, not in public, not even for a photo. He sent word through a low-ranking official: "We don't meet those who serve foreign masters." The envoys stood stranded in a guest house for 4 days, ignored by a country that had decided they didn't matter. When they finally flew back to Abuja, they carried something heavier than their briefcases: humiliation. And the story leaked within hours. Across Africa, millions watched as Nigeria's power was rejected in real time. The giant of West Africa had been told to leave, and Traoré didn't even bother to say it himself. This is the story of a mission that failed before it began. Of envoys sent to manipulate a leader who refused to be bought. Of the day Ouagadougou slammed its doors on the old order, and a new Africa stepped into the light. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. The conference room in Asso Rock smelled of leather and expensive cologne. 5 men sat around the mahogany table, chosen not for their loyalty to Nigeria, but for their willingness to do what needed to be done without asking questions. Tinubu stood at the head of the table, hands clasped behind his back, staring at a map of West Africa pinned to the wall. Red circles marked Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, the 3 nations that had turned their backs on ECOWAS, turned their backs on France, and worst of all, turned their backs on Abuja's authority.
Traoré thinks he's untouchable, Tinubu said, his voice low but sharp.
He thinks because he wears fatigues and talks about sovereignty, the people will protect him forever. He's wrong. One of the envoys, a former diplomat named Ambassador Okoro, leaned forward. "Mr. President, the French tried this already. They sent delegations. They froze aid." Traoré didn't blink. Tinubu turned slowly, his eyes cold. "The French are weak. They beg. We don't beg. We remind people who holds the power in this region." He tapped the map with his finger, landing directly on Burkina Faso. "You will go to Ouagadougou. You will carry documents promising trade agreements, security cooperation, and economic support. You will smile. You will be polite. And you will make it clear: if Traoré refuses to return to ECOWAS, if he continues to align with Mali and Niger, Nigeria will cut him off completely. No trade, no diplomacy, no protection." Another envoy, a younger man named Chike, shifted uncomfortably. "And if he still refuses?" Tinubu's smile was thin and humorless. "Then we make sure the world knows he chose isolation over cooperation. We frame him as a dictator rejecting democracy. We leak stories. We apply pressure through regional allies. We make his defiance costly." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Traoré is popular now, but popularity fades when people are hungry. That's how this game works. The men nodded, though none looked entirely convinced. They had heard the rumors, whispers that Traoré was different, that he wasn't motivated by money or power, that he actually believed in the revolution he preached. But Tinubu dismissed those whispers as naive idealism. Every leader had a price. Every leader could be broken. "You leave tomorrow," Tinubu said, turning back to the map. "Make sure he understands what's at stake." The meeting ended. The envoys gathered their briefcases and left the room, their footsteps echoing down the marble hallways of power. None of them knew they were walking into a trap, not one set by Traore, but one set by their own arrogance. They believed the old rules still applied. They believed Africa still bent to the will of its largest economy. They believed wrong. Outside, the city of Abuja hummed with life, unaware that a mission of manipulation was about to backfire in the most humiliating way possible. The private jet took off from Abuja at dawn, slicing through clouds painted orange and red by the rising sun. Inside, the 5 envoys reviewed their documents one last time. Trade proposals that promised billions in infrastructure investment, security agreements that offered Nigerian military support against insurgents, and economic partnerships that sounded generous on paper, but hid clauses designed to bind Burkina Faso to Abuja's interests. Ambassador Okoro sat by the window, watching the landscape below shift from green forest to dry savanna. He had been doing this for 30 years, flying to capitals, delivering messages, negotiating deals that looked like cooperation but functioned like chains. It was the nature of regional politics. The strong dictated terms, the weak accepted them. It had always been that way. But something felt different this time. The intelligence reports his team received painted a troubling picture. Traore wasn't behaving like the leaders Okoro had dealt with before. He didn't build mansions. He didn't stash money in foreign banks. He lived in modest quarters and ate with his soldiers. His speeches weren't written by consultants. They were raw, angry, and directed at the very system Okoro represented. "Do you think he'll even see us?" Chike asked, breaking the silence. Okoro didn't answer immediately. He wanted to say yes to reassure the younger man that their mission would succeed. But doubt gnawed him. "He has to." Okoro finally said, "Refusing to meet us would be an insult to Nigeria. He's not stupid enough to do that." Another envoy, a man named Dr. Adeleke, laughed bitterly. He expelled the French. He told ECOWAS to leave Burkina alone. He called Tinubu a puppet on live television last month. You think insulting Nigeria bothers him? The cabin fell silent. The truth hung in the air like smoke. They were not flying to negotiate. They were flying to test whether the old order still held. And if it didn't, if Traore slammed the door in their faces, the humiliation wouldn't just belong to them. It would belong to Tinubu. It would belong to Nigeria. It would belong to every leader in West Africa, who had spent decades pretending to be independent while taking orders from Paris and Abuja. The jet descended through thin clouds, and below them, Ouagadougou appeared, a sprawling city of red dust and determination, a capital that had buried one puppet government after another, until finally someone emerged who refused to play the game. The landing was smooth, but as the wheels touched the runway, every man on that plane felt the ground shift beneath them. They had no idea that their arrival had already been noted, analyzed, and dismissed. Traore's intelligence network had intercepted their communications weeks ago. He knew what they wanted, he knew what they carried, and he had already made his decision. When the envoys stepped off the plane into the blistering heat, they were greeted not by government officials but by silence. The guest house where the envoys were taken was clean but cold, the kind of place reserved for visitors who were tolerated, not welcomed. No flags flew outside, no security details stood at attention, no cameras flashed. It was as if Ouagadougou had swallowed them whole and decided they weren't worth acknowledging. Ambassador Okoro checked his phone for the 10th time in an hour. No messages from the presidential office. No confirmation of a meeting. No schedule. Nothing. He called his contact in Burkina's foreign ministry, a man who had always been reliable in the past, but the call went straight to voicemail. He tried again. Same result. "This is ridiculous," Dr. Adeleke muttered, pacing the small sitting room. "We've been here for 6 hours, and not a single official has contacted us." Chike sat on the edge of a worn couch, staring at his untouched tea. "Maybe they're testing us, making us wait to show dominance. Or maybe they're not going to meet us at all," Okoro said quietly. The words landed like stones. The other envoys turned to stare at him, and in their eyes he saw the same fear he felt, the fear of irrelevance, of being ignored by a country they had always seen as smaller, weaker, dependent. Nigeria was the giant of West Africa. Its economy dwarfed Burkina Faso's. Its military could crush any neighbor. Its influence reached into every capital. And yet here they sat, powerless, waiting for a phone call that might never come. "We should demand a meeting," Chike said, standing abruptly. "We represent the president of Nigeria. They can't just ignore us." "They already are," Okoro replied. Night fell. The envoys ate a quiet dinner of rice and stew, brought by silent staff, who refused to make eye contact. The television in the corner played local news in French, and halfway through the broadcast, Traore appeared on screen. He was addressing a crowd of soldiers and civilians, his voice steady and defiant. "We do not negotiate with those who come to buy our dignity," Traore said, his words cutting through the static. "We do not shake hands with those who serve foreign interests. We do not meet with envoys who carry chains disguised as gifts." The camera panned across the crowd, thousands of people cheering, waving flags, chanting his name. And in that moment, the envoys understood. This wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't even a confrontation. It was a public rejection. Traore wasn't refusing to meet them privately. He was refusing to meet them at all. And he was making sure the entire country knew why. Komodoro felt his stomach tighten. The mission was already over. They had lost before the first handshake, before the first conversation, before the first lie could even leave their lips. And the worst part was that Traore had turned their presence into a symbol. Proof that the old powers were still trying to manipulate Africa, and proof that the new generation was refusing to play along. "We need to leave," Okoro said, his voice hollow. "Now." But leaving would be an admission of defeat. Staying would be an exercise in humiliation. There was no winning move left on the board. They were trapped in a city that had already decided they didn't matter, carrying a message that no one wanted to hear. Outside, the streets of Ouagadougou pulsed with energy. Not the energy of chaos, but of certainty. People danced, music played, flags waved, and somewhere in the presidential compound, Traoré sat with his advisors, knowing that his silence had spoken louder than any speech ever could. By the third day, the envoys stopped pretending. There would be no meeting, no handshake, no negotiation. They sat in the guest house like ghosts, invisible to a city that had moved on without noticing they were there. Ambassador Okoro spent hours drafting reports to Abuja, trying to frame the situation in a way that didn't sound like total failure. But every sentence he wrote felt like an excuse. "What do we even tell him?" Dr. Adeleke asked, slumped in a chair. "That we flew all the way here to be ignored?" "We tell him the truth," Okoro said, though he wasn't sure what the truth even was anymore. That Traoré was more defiant than they expected, that Burkina Faso no longer cared about Nigeria's approval, that the balance of power in West Africa had shifted so completely that envoys from the region's largest economy could be treated like irrelevant tourists. Chike stood by the window watching the street below. A group of young people passed by, laughing and talking, their phones out, probably recording videos for social media. "They know we're here," he said quietly. "The whole country knows. And they don't care." That was the part that stung the most. Not the anger, not the hostility, but the indifference. Traoré hadn't needed to insult them or threaten them. He had simply erased them from the conversation. And in doing so, he had sent a message far more powerful than any speech. Nigeria's influence had limits now. Abuja's commands could be ignored. The era of automatic obedience was over. On the fourth day, a low-ranking official finally arrived. Not to arrange a meeting, but to inform them that President Traoré's schedule would not permit any engagements with foreign delegations during their visit. The official was polite but emotionless, delivering the message as if reading a weather report. No apology. No explanation, just a statement of fact. "This is an insult to Nigeria," Dr. Adeleke said, his voice shaking with anger. The official blinked slowly. "President Traoré does not meet with representatives of governments that serve foreign interests. If you wish to understand his position, you may read his recent speeches. They are available online." And with that, the official left. The envoys sat in stunned silence. They had been dismissed, not negotiated with, not debated, dismissed. as if they were salesmen offering a product no one wanted, as if their entire mission, their credentials, their authority meant nothing in this room, in this city, in this new Africa that was waking up and refusing to go back to sleep. "We have to leave," Okoro said, his voice flat. "Staying here any longer just makes it worse." They packed quickly, their movements mechanical, their faces blank. The flight back to Abuja was scheduled for the next morning. None of them spoke as they loaded their luggage into the van. None of them looked back at the guest house as they drove away. And none of them knew that by the time their plane took off, the story would already be spreading across the continent. Not through official channels, but through the people. Through social media, through a generation that had been waiting their whole lives to see someone stand up to the powers that had kept Africa on its knees. The silence in Ouagadougou had screamed louder than any protest. And the world was listening. The envoys landed in Abuja, at dusk. The city lights glittering below like false promises. They exited the plane in silence, their humiliation wrapped around them like a shroud. No one was there to greet them. No officials, no press, just the cold efficiency of an airport that processed their return as if they had never left. Ambassador Okoro went straight to Aso Rock, knowing that delaying the conversation with Tinubu would only make it worse. He was escorted to the same conference room where the mission had been planned, and when he entered, Tinubu was already there, standing by the window, his back turned. "He refused to meet us," Okoro said, deciding to deliver the news quickly, like ripping off a bandage. Tinubu didn't turn. "I know. You know, it's already online," Tinubu said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Videos, commentary, analysis. Every blogger and activist in West Africa is talking about how Nigeria's envoys were rejected, how Traore humiliated us, how the giant of Africa was told to leave." Korokoro felt his chest tighten. "We tried to keep it quiet." "You can't keep anything quiet anymore," Tinubu snapped, finally turning. His face was a mask of barely restrained anger. "One phone call, one leak, and the entire continent knows. Do you understand what you've done? You've made us look weak. You've made me look weak." "We followed your orders," Okoro said, his voice rising despite himself. "You told us to go, we went. Traore refused. That's not our fault." "Then, whose fault is it?" Tinubu demanded. "Mine? For believing we still had influence? For thinking a young soldier in Ouagadougou could be reasoned with?" He laughed bitterly. "The French warned me. They said Traore was different. I didn't listen. I thought we were different. I thought Nigeria still mattered." The room fell silent. Kuro had never seen Tinubu like this. Not the confident politician who commanded rooms and bent opponents to his will, but a man realizing that the world had changed while he was still playing by old rules. "What do we do now?" Okoro asked quietly. Tinubu turned back to the window, his reflection ghostly in the glass. "Now we deal with the consequences. The other ECOWAS leaders will see this. They'll wonder if Nigeria can still lead. The French will see this and question our usefulness. And worst of all, every young revolutionary in West Africa will see this and believe they can do the same thing." He was right. Within hours, the story had exploded. Not just in Burkina Faso, but across the continent. Hashtags trended. Memes spread. Videos of Traore's speeches were shared millions of times, each one framed as proof that Africa was finally standing up, finally saying no, finally rejecting the puppets and proxies that had ruled for so long. In Ghana, students marched with signs reading, "We stand with Traore." In Senegal, activists projected his image onto buildings. In Kenya, musicians wrote songs about the envoys who flew home empty-handed. The narrative was writing itself, and Nigeria was cast as the villain. Not the hero, not the leader, but the enforcer of a dying order that young Africans wanted to bury. Tinubu knew what this meant. It meant his credibility was shattered. It meant his authority was questioned. It meant every decision he made from now on would be examined through the lens of this failure. And it meant that Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a 30-something soldier from one of Africa's poorest countries, had just beaten the president of Africa's largest economy without firing a single shot. "Leave," Tinubu said quietly. "All of you, get out." Okoro didn't argue. He gathered his things and left, walking through hallways that suddenly felt colder, emptier. As he stepped outside into the night air, he pulled out his phone and opened social media. The first thing he saw was a video of Traore speaking to a crowd, his voice echoing through speakers. They sent messengers of deceit. Traore said, and we sent them home with the truth. Africa will no longer bow. Ukuro closed the app and walked to his car. The mission was over. But the story was just beginning. Tinubu didn't sleep that night. He sat in his private office, the lights off, scrolling through report after report, article after article, watching his reputation disintegrate in real time. The headlines were brutal. Nigeria's influence crumbles in Ouagadougou. Traore rejects Tinubu's envoys, exposes neo-colonial tactics. The giant of Africa falls silent. Worse than the headlines were the comments. Thousands upon thousands of young Africans celebrating the rejection, praising Traore as the leader they had been waiting for, and condemning Tinubu as a relic of the past, a man who took orders from Paris and Washington while pretending to represent African interests. One comment in particular stuck with him. Tinubu thought he could buy Burkina like his masters bought him. Traore showed him the price of dignity can't be paid in dollars. He threw his phone across the room. His advisors had been calling all evening, urging him to release a statement, to control the narrative, to spin the story in Nigeria's favor. But what could he say? That the mission had been a success? That being ignored was part of the plan? That Nigeria didn't care about Burkina Faso anyway? Every option felt like surrender. There was a knock at the door. Tinubu didn't respond, but the door opened anyway. His chief of staff, a man named Bello, stepped inside, his face grim. "Sir, we need to respond," Bello said. "The silence is making it worse." "What do you want me to say?" Tinubu asked, his voice hollow. "That a captain from Burkina Faso outsmarted the president of Nigeria. That our envoys were treated like beggars. That our influence in West Africa is dying. We say the meeting was postponed due to scheduling conflicts," Bello suggested. "We say there was a misunderstanding. No one will believe that," Tinubu interrupted. Traore already told his people why he refused. "The truth is out there. Lying now just makes us look desperate." Bello hesitated. "Then what do we do?" Tinubu stood, walking to the window that overlooked the city. Abuja stretched out before him. The capital of Africa's most powerful nation, built on oil money and political games, a city where power was bought and sold like any other commodity. For decades, that model had worked. For decades, Nigeria had been the kingmaker, the deal broker, the enforcer of regional stability on behalf of external powers. But Traore had exposed the rot beneath the shine. He had shown that Nigeria's influence wasn't built on respect or shared vision. It was built on fear and money. And when a leader emerged who didn't fear Nigeria and couldn't be bought, the entire system collapsed. "We isolate him," Tinubu said finally. "We work with ECOWAS to increase pressure. We coordinate with our allies to cut off his support. We make sure Traore understands that defiance has consequences." "That could take months," Bello said. "And it might not work. He's popular. His people love him." "Popularity doesn't feed people," Tinubu replied coldly. "And when the sanctions bite, when the economy struggles, when the people start to suffer, they'll turn on him. That's how this game works." But even as he said it, Tinubu knew the game had changed. Traore wasn't playing for personal wealth or power. He was playing for legacy, for principle, for the idea that Africa could finally govern itself without permission. And ideas, Tinubu understood with sinking dread, were far more dangerous than any army. Outside, the night deepened, and across West Africa, in bedrooms and cafes and streets, young people stayed up late, talking about the day a leader stood firm and sent Nigeria's envoys home empty-handed. They talked about what it meant. They talked about what came next, and they began to believe that change wasn't just possible. It was already happening. 3 weeks after the envoys returned, the full weight of the failure had settled over Abuja, like fog. Tinubu's approval ratings dropped. ECOWAS meetings grew tense as other leaders questioned Nigeria's ability to lead. And every day, new videos emerged from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Young people dancing in the streets, soldiers saluting Traore, activists calling for the same revolution in their own countries. The story had stopped being about a diplomatic snub. It had become a symbol. Ambassador Okoro watched it all from his quiet retirement, having resigned the week after returning from Ouagadougou. He told himself he was tired, that he had served long enough. But the truth was simpler. He couldn't stomach representing a system that had become so transparent in its hypocrisy. He had spent 30 years pretending Nigeria's foreign policy was about African unity, when it had always been about maintaining control for external powers. Traore's refusal had stripped away that pretense, and Okoro no longer had the energy to maintain the lie. In Ouagadougou, life moved forward. Traore never mentioned the envoys again. He didn't need to. His silence had said everything. Instead, he focused on governance, building schools, restructuring the military, rooting out corruption, forging alliances with Mali and Niger that bypassed traditional power structures. He wasn't perfect. Mistakes were made, critics emerged, but he represented something that had been missing from African politics for too long, a leader who genuinely seemed to care more about his people than his bank account. One evening, a reporter asked Traore about the Nigerian envoys during a press conference. Traore paused, considering his words carefully. "They came offering gifts that weren't theirs to give," he said. "They came with promises written by people in Paris and Washington. They came expecting us to bow because that's what Burkina Faso has always done. But we are not the Burkina Faso of yesterday. We are not the Africa of yesterday. And when they understand that, perhaps we can have a real conversation, one based on respect, not submission." The clip went viral, not because it was inflammatory, but because it was true. And truth, spoken plainly by someone who had nothing to gain from lying, carried a weight that no propaganda could match. Tinubu watched the clip alone in his office. He felt something he hadn't felt in years: doubt. Not about his policies or his strategies, but about the entire framework he had operated within. What if Traore was right? What if the model of African leadership hit on foreign approval and regional dominance was dying? What if the young people cheering in the streets represented the future, and he represented the past? He didn't have answers, only questions that kept him awake at night. Months passed. The story faded from headlines but lingered in memory. Burkina Faso didn't collapse. Traore didn't fall. And slowly, cautiously, other leaders began to ask difficult questions about their own relationships with foreign powers, their own compromises, their own failures to put their people first. Change came slowly, unevenly, imperfectly. But it came. And it began the day envoys landed in Ouagadougou expecting obedience and met silence instead. The day a young captain refused to play a game his predecessors had always lost. The day Africa remembered that dignity cannot be bought, sold, or negotiated away. The day the doors slammed shut on the old order, and a new generation stepped through.